In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Willow Creek Estates, life moved at a slow and predictable pace. The houses were all painted in soft pastels, their lawns perfectly manicured like something out of a magazine. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved politely as they drove by, where kids rode bikes down the sidewalks, and where Sundays meant backyard barbecues and lemonade on porches. Everything seemed picture perfect, almost too perfect. For Mark Thompson, moving to Willow Creek felt like stepping into a dream. He had spent years working long hours as a software engineer in a bustling city, commuting through traffic jams and breathing polluted air. When he and his wife, Sarah, decided it was time for a change, this idyllic suburb seemed like the answer to their prayers. They wanted a simpler life, a place where they could raise a family, enjoy weekends together, and escape the chaos of urban living. But beneath the polished surface of Willow Creek lay a system that kept everyone in line: the Homeowners Association, or HOA. The HOA wasn't just a group of neighbors trying to keep things tidy. It was more like a small government with its own set of rules, enforcers, and penalties. From the color of your curtains to the type of plants you could grow in your garden, the HOA dictated nearly every aspect of life in the community. And if you stepped out of line, well, there would be consequences. Mark knew about the HOA before buying the house. It came up during the orientation meeting, but he didn't think much of it. After all, how bad could it really be? Sure, there were some nitpicky guidelines, but he figured it was worth it for the peace and beauty of the neighborhood. Plus, he reasoned, he and Sarah weren't the type to cause trouble. They'd follow the rules, blend in, and live happily ever after. What Mark didn't realize, however, was that Willow Creek wasn't just any ordinary suburb. Beneath its calm exterior, tensions simmered. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors about fines and warnings, while others grumbled about unfair treatment from the HOA board. There was even talk of a few families who had been forced to sell their homes because they couldn't comply with the endless demands. But none of this reached Mark's ears, at least not yet. Sarah, on the other hand, took everything in stride. She was warm and friendly, quickly becoming a favorite among the moms in the neighborhood. With her sunny smile and easygoing nature, she fit right in. She joined the local book club, volunteered at school events, and hosted coffee mornings for the women on their street. To most people, she seemed like the epitome of suburban charm. What no one suspected, not even Mark, was that Sarah had a secret. While she played the role of a stay-at-home mom flawlessly, she also held one of the highest-ranking positions in the U.S. military. As the commander of a tactical air wing, she oversaw operations involving some of the most advanced aircraft in the world. Her job required precision, strategy, and leadership skills honed over decades of service. Yet outside of work, she rarely spoke about her career. For her, home was a sanctuary, a place to unwind and leave the stresses of her high-stakes job behind. To the residents of Willow Creek, Sarah was simply another face in the crowd. They admired her flower beds, complimented her baking skills, and envied her seemingly perfect marriage. No one guessed that beneath her cheerful demeanor lay the mind of someone capable of orchestrating complex missions and commanding elite teams. If they had known, perhaps they wouldn't have underestimated her or dared to cross her. As the weeks passed, Mark and Sarah settled into their new routine. Mark worked from his home office, tapping away at his keyboard while sipping coffee. Sarah spent her days managing household tasks, running errands, and occasionally disappearing for what she called business trips. Mark assumed these trips were related to freelance consulting or part-time work, though he never pressed her for details. Their lives were peaceful, predictable, and exactly what they had hoped for when they moved to Willow Creek. But unbeknownst to them, trouble was brewing. In a neighborhood ruled by strict guidelines and enforced conformity, the smallest infractions could spark outrage. Whether it was a misplaced trash can or an unruly hedge, nothing escaped the watchful eyes of the HOA enforcers. These self-appointed guardians patrolled the streets, clipboard in hand, ready to issue citations for even the slightest deviation from the rules. They prided themselves on maintaining order, but their methods often bordered on obsessive. It wouldn't take long for the Thompsons to find themselves caught in the crosshairs of the HOA. What started as minor complaints would soon escalate into something far more serious. Little did anyone know, the quiet couple next door was about to turn the entire neighborhood upside down and reveal a side of themselves that no one saw coming. The first sign of trouble arrived on a crisp autumn morning, slipped silently under the Thompsons' front door while they were still sipping their coffee. It was a neatly typed letter from the HOA, printed on official-looking paper with the organization's logo emblazoned at the top. The tone was polite but firm, listing several violations that needed immediate attention. Mark picked up the letter and scanned it, his brow furrowing as he read aloud to Sarah. "Your mailbox is leaning slightly to the left," he said, glancing out the window at the offending item in question. "This violates Section 3.2 of the HOA guidelines regarding uniformity." He paused, shaking his head in disbelief. "Seriously? Our mailbox is crooked?" Sarah chuckled, setting down her mug. "Well, I guess we're rebels now," she joked, though there was a hint of irritation in her voice. She walked over to the window and peered outside. Sure enough, the mailbox did lean ever so slightly, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Still, according to the HOA, this was grounds for concern. But the mailbox wasn't the only issue. The letter went on to list other infractions. Their garden gnomes were deemed non-compliant decor. The color of their welcome mat clashed with the approved palette, and Mark's car had been spotted parked on the street instead of in the driveway, not once but twice. Each violation came with a deadline for correction and a warning that failure to comply would result in fines or further action. At first, both Mark and Sarah laughed it off. They figured it was just an overzealous neighbor, or perhaps a new HOA board member eager to make their mark. Surely no one actually cared about something as trivial as a leaning mailbox or a rogue garden gnome. But as the days passed, more letters arrived, each one escalating in urgency and severity. The warnings grew sharper, the deadlines tighter, and the penalties steeper. One evening, after receiving yet another notice, Mark sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the stack of papers. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "They're acting like we've committed some kind of crime." Sarah leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "It's not about us," she said thoughtfully. "It's about control. These people thrive on rules because it makes them feel important. If they can't find something to nitpick, they'll invent it." Mark sighed, rubbing his temples. "Still, we should probably fix the mailbox. Maybe repaint the front door too. It's starting to look a little worn anyway." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "Fine. But if they send another letter about my gnomes, I'm going to lose it." Despite their attempts to appease the HOA, the complaints kept coming. A week later, a bright orange sticker appeared on their garage door, citing yet another infraction. Excessive personal items visible from the street. Apparently, the bicycles leaning against the side of the house were considered unsightly. Then came a notice about the holiday lights they'd strung up, a full month before Christmas. According to the HOA, decorations could only be displayed during designated times, and early displays disrupted the aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. By now, Mark was growing frustrated. He prided himself on being a reasonable person, someone who followed the rules and avoided conflict. But the constant barrage of letters felt less like constructive feedback and more like harassment. He began to dread opening the mail, wondering what obscure rule he'd violated next. Sarah, meanwhile, was reaching her limit. She had always been patient, choosing to ignore the petty grievances rather than engage in arguments. But the relentless scrutiny was wearing thin. One afternoon, after finding yet another notice taped to their door, she snapped. "That's it," she exclaimed, crumpling the paper in her fist. "I didn't sign up for this nonsense when we moved here. Who do these people think they are?" Mark tried to calm her down. "I know it's frustrating, but maybe we should just go to one of their meetings, talk to them face to face, and explain things. Maybe they'll back off if we show them we're willing to cooperate." Reluctantly, Sarah agreed. The following week, they attended an HOA meeting held in the community center, a bland room filled with folding chairs and fluorescent lighting. The atmosphere was tense, with residents sitting stiffly as the board members rattled off updates and complaints. When it was their turn to speak, Mark stood nervously, clutching a folder of notes he'd prepared. Hi, he began, clearing his throat. We're the Thompsons, and we wanted to address some concerns raised by the HOA. We understand the importance of maintaining standards in the neighborhood, but some of the violations mentioned seem, well, minor, like the mailbox issue. Is it really necessary to enforce such strict rules about something so small? His words were met with icy silence. The HOA president, a stern man named Harold, adjusted his glasses and fixed Mark with a condescending glare. Mr. Thompson, he said slowly, the rules exist for a reason. Uniformity ensures property values remain high and the neighborhood maintains its appeal. Without enforcement, chaos would ensue. Before Mark could respond, Sarah stepped forward, her expression calm but steely. With all due respect, she said, her voice steady, we're not asking for exemptions. We're asking for common sense. No one buys a home here expecting to be micromanaged over every little detail. If your goal is to create a welcoming community, maybe focus less on punishing people and more on fostering goodwill. Her statement drew murmurs from the crowd, though whether they were supportive or skeptical was hard to tell. Harold dismissed their concerns with a wave of his hand, insisting that compliance was non-negotiable. As they left the meeting, Mark felt defeated, but Sarah radiated quiet determination. That night, as they sat in the living room discussing the debacle, Sarah turned to Mark with a wry smile. You know, she said, if they want to play hardball, they have no idea who they're dealing with. Mark raised an eyebrow. What are you thinking? Sarah's smile widened. Let's just say I might have a few tricks up my sleeve, and if they push us too far, they'll regret it. Though Mark didn't fully understand what she meant, he trusted her completely. After all, Sarah had faced far bigger challenges in her life and won. Whatever she had planned, he knew it would be unforgettable. The tension in the Thompson household grew thicker with each passing day. The HOA's demands were relentless, and their patience was wearing thin. Mark tried to stay optimistic, reminding himself that this was just a phase, a temporary hiccup in an otherwise perfect life. But Sarah wasn't one to let things slide, especially when they started feeling like personal attacks. One evening, after receiving yet another letter, this time demanding they repaint their front door within 30 days or face eviction proceedings, Sarah reached her breaking point. She stood in the kitchen holding the offending notice in her hand, her jaw clenched tight. Her eyes scanned the document as if trying to decipher some hidden meaning behind the words, but there was none. It was plain and simple. Comply or leave. Enough is enough, she said finally, slamming the paper onto the counter. The sound echoed through the room, startling Mark, who had been scrolling absent-mindedly on his phone at the table. He looked up, sensing the storm brewing in her voice. What's going on? He asked cautiously. Sarah turned to him, her expression a mix of frustration and determination. These people are out of control. They think they can dictate every little detail of our lives because they have a rule book and a clipboard. Well, guess what? I've dealt with worse than this. If they want to play games, fine, but they're about to learn that I don't back down easily. Mark blinked, unsure whether to feel relieved or alarmed. On one hand, he admired Sarah's resolve. On the other, he knew her well enough to recognize the glint of mischief in her eye. When Sarah got like this, it usually meant trouble for whoever crossed her path. Okay, Mark said slowly, leaning back in his chair. What exactly are you planning? Sarah didn't answer right away. Instead, she pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. After a moment, she pressed call, pacing the kitchen as the line rang. Mark watched curiously, wondering who she could possibly be contacting over something as trivial as a front door color. Hey, it's me, she said into the phone, her tone calm but authoritative. Listen, I need a favor. Can you send over a team tomorrow morning? We're going to run a little demonstration. Mark's eyebrows shot up. Wait, what kind of demonstration? He interrupted, standing now. And who are you talking to? Sarah waved him off, still focused on the call. Yeah, bring the usual gear. Oh, and make sure we have clearance for airspace. Thanks. She hung up without elaborating, slipping the phone back into her pocket. Mark stared at her wide-eyed. Care to explain? She smiled faintly, crossing her arms. Let's just say I'm calling in reinforcements. These HOA enforcers clearly don't understand who they're messing with. So, I'm going to give them a taste of what happens when you push someone too far. Mark opened his mouth to protest, then closed it again. There was no point arguing, once Sarah made up her mind. Besides, deep down he couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement. Whatever she had planned, it was bound to be unforgettable. The next morning, strange things began happening around the house. A convoy of unmarked trucks rumbled down the quiet streets of Willow Creek, drawing curious stares from neighbors, peering out their windows. The vehicles pulled into the Thompsons' driveway, parking neatly in rows as men in military fatigues hopped out, carrying crates marked government property. Mark watched from the porch, sipping his coffee and trying to act nonchalant despite the growing knot of nerves in his stomach. Sarah?" He called toward the open garage, where she was directing the operation. "You might want to prepare me for whatever's coming next." Sarah emerged, clipboard in hand, looking every bit the commander she was. "Relax," she said breezily. "We're just setting up a perimeter, nothing crazy." "Nothing crazy?" Mark echoed, gesturing to the scene unfolding before him. "There are armed soldiers in our backyard, Sarah. And what's with all the drones hovering overhead?" Sure enough, several sleek drones buzzed lazily above the property, their cameras scanning the area with mechanical precision. Spotlights illuminated the yard, casting sharp shadows across the grass. Loudspeakers crackled to life, emitting a low hum that sent shivers down Mark's spine. "This isn't exactly subtle," he muttered under his breath. Sarah chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. "Subtlety isn't the goal here. I want them to know we mean business. Trust me, this will get their attention." As the day wore on, word spread quickly through the neighborhood. Neighbors gathered in small clusters, whispering and pointing at the spectacle unfolding at the Thompsons' home. Some snapped photos with their phones, while others debated whether to call the police. No one could figure out what was going on, but everyone agreed it was unlike anything Willow Creek had ever seen. Meanwhile, inside the house, Mark paced nervously. "Are you sure this isn't going to blow up in our faces?" he asked, peeking out the window. "I mean, technically, aren't we violating some kind of noise ordinance or airspace regulation?" Sarah rolled her eyes, unfazed. "Don't worry so much. Everything's been cleared. Besides, if the HOA tries to report us, they'll find themselves dealing with a lot more than a few garden gnomes." Her confidence was infectious, and Mark found himself smiling despite his reservations. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were playing with fire. The HOA might be petty, but they weren't stupid. Pushing back against them this aggressively could escalate into something neither of them anticipated. Late that afternoon, the first sign of retaliation arrived. A black SUV pulled up to the curb outside their house, and two men in suits stepped out. They wore badges clipped to their lapels and carried clipboards identical to the ones the HOA inspectors used. As they approached the gate, one of them spoke, into a walkie-talkie, presumably relaying their position. Mark watched anxiously as Sarah strode confidently to meet them. Dressed in tactical gear and flanked by two uniformed officers, she looked every inch the commanding officer she was. The men hesitated, clearly taken aback by the sight before them. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" Sarah asked coolly, her voice carrying a note of authority that brooked no argument. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association," one of them replied, attempting to sound firm but faltering under her gaze. "We've received reports of unauthorized activity on this property. You're in violation of multiple codes, and we're here to issue a formal warning." Sarah raised an eyebrow, stepping closer. "Is that so? Funny, because my team has already secured clearance for this area. Did your bosses mention that failing to evacuate restricted airspace could result in serious consequences?" The men exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsure how to respond. One of them fumbled with his clipboard, muttering something about checking their files. Without waiting for further discussion, Sarah gestured to the officers beside her, who moved to escort the intruders off the property. As the SUV sped away, Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "Well," he said dryly, "that was intense." Sarah smirked, brushing off her hands. "Phase 1 complete. Now let's see how long it takes them to regroup. Little did they know, the real showdown was only beginning. The days that followed were unlike anything Willow Creek Estates had ever experienced. What started as a quiet suburban neighborhood quickly transformed into something resembling a military operation. The Thompsons' home became the epicenter of activity, with drones buzzing overhead, spotlights illuminating the property at all hours, and uniformed personnel moving in and out of the house with purpose. To the neighbors, it was both fascinating and unsettling, a mystery they couldn't quite unravel. Mark found himself caught between awe and anxiety. On one hand, he was impressed by Sarah's ability to mobilize resources and execute her plan with precision. On the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking a fine line. While Sarah assured him everything was under control, Mark couldn't help but wonder if this level of escalation might have unintended consequences. Sarah, however, remained unfazed. She worked tirelessly, coordinating with her team and ensuring every detail was accounted for. In the mornings, she reviewed plans over coffee, her phone buzzing constantly with updates from colleagues. By afternoon, she was outside, inspecting equipment and giving orders to the crew. At night, she sat at the kitchen table, poring over maps and documents, her mind always racing ahead to the next step. "What exactly are you preparing for?" Mark asked one evening as he leaned against the doorway, watching her scribble notes on a legal pad. Sarah glanced up, her expression calm but focused. "A demonstration," she replied simply. "Something that will make them think twice about messing with us, or anyone else in this neighborhood." "But isn't this already enough?" Mark gestured toward the window where the faint glow of floodlights illuminated their backyard. "They know we're serious. Why push it further?" Sarah set down her pen and looked at him, her eyes softening slightly. "Because this isn't just about us anymore," she said. "It's about standing up to bullies who think they can intimidate people into submission. If we back down now, what message does that send? That they can walk all over anyone. Who doesn't fight back?" Mark sighed, knowing she was right. Still, he couldn't help but feel uneasy. "Just promise me you won't do anything too extreme," he said finally. "I don't want to wake up tomorrow and find ourselves on the news, or worse, in jail." Sarah smiled, reaching across the table to squeeze his hand. "Don't worry, I've got this under control, trust me." Meanwhile, word of the Thompsons' standoff spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. Neighbors whispered behind closed doors, speculating about what was really going on. Some assumed the couple had ties to some secret government agency, while others joked that aliens must be involved. Whatever the truth, everyone agreed it was the most exciting thing to happen in years. Curiosity soon turned to concern when rumors reached the HOA board. Harold, the self-appointed president, called an emergency meeting to discuss the situation. The room buzzed with tension as members debated how to handle the escalating conflict. Some argued for immediate legal action, threatening lawsuits and eviction notices. Others suggested backing off, fearing the Thompsons might retaliate in ways they couldn't predict. "We need to assert our authority," Harold declared, pounding his fist on the table. "If we let them get away with this, it sets a dangerous precedent. Everyone will start thinking they can ignore the rules." "With all due respect," interjected Linda, the treasurer, "have you seen what's happening over there? Those aren't just garden lights. They've got military-grade equipment. Do we really want to provoke them further?" Harold bristled at the challenge but said nothing. Deep down, he knew Linda had a point. The Thompsons weren't ordinary homeowners, and whatever they were planning, it was clear they weren't bluffing. Back at the Thompson residence, preparations continued around the clock. Crates of supplies arrived daily, unloaded by men in fatigues who worked with quiet efficiency. Loudspeakers blared warnings throughout the day, creating an atmosphere of controlled chaos. Even the air seemed charged with anticipation, as though everyone knew the climax was near. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sarah gathered her team for a final briefing. Standing in the driveway surrounded by floodlights and humming generators, she addressed them with the same commanding presence she used during missions overseas. "Tomorrow is showtime," she began, her voice steady and clear. "Our goal isn't to hurt anyone or cause unnecessary damage. It's to send a message, to remind them that power doesn't come from enforcing arbitrary rules. It comes from earning respect. We'll start with a warning, then escalate only if necessary. Understood? Her team nodded in unison, their expressions resolute. Satisfied, Sarah dismissed them and turned to Mark, who stood nearby, arms crossed. You, sure about this? He asked quietly. She nodded, her gaze unwavering. Absolutely. They've pushed us to our limits, and now it's time to push back. But don't worry, I've planned for every scenario. No matter what happens, we'll come out on top. The following morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that usually brought peace to Willow Creek. But today, the streets buzzed with nervous energy. Residents peeked through curtains and huddled on porches, waiting to see what would unfold. Even the mail carrier hesitated before approaching the Thompsons' property, unsure whether it was safe to deliver the day's letters. At precisely 9 a.m., the loudspeakers crackled to life. A voice boomed across the neighborhood, echoing off rooftops and startling birds into flight. Attention, Willow Creek Estates residents. This is Commander Sarah Thompson addressing you from my property. Due to repeated harassment and threats from certain individuals, I have authorized enhanced security measures to protect my family and home. Please remain indoors and avoid entering restricted areas until further notice. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. For the first time, the truth about Sarah's identity came to light. Neighbors stared at each other in disbelief, piecing together clues they'd missed before. Was it possible that the woman who hosted book club meetings and baked cookies for school fundraisers also commanded a tactical air wing? As the realization sank in, so did the gravity of the situation. The HOA enforcers, who had been gearing up for another round of inspections, hesitated. Their confidence wavered as they realized they were no longer dealing with ordinary homeowners. Instead, they faced someone with access to resources and authority far beyond their comprehension. For Mark, watching his wife take charge was both exhilarating and humbling. He'd always known she was extraordinary, but seeing her in action reminded him why he admired her so deeply. Whether confronting bureaucrats or organizing military operations, Sarah approached every challenge with intelligence, determination, and grace. And yet, as the day wore on and tensions mounted, Mark couldn't help but wonder, would this bold move bring resolution or ignite a battle neither side was prepared for? The day of the scheduled eviction arrived with an air of anticipation that hung heavy over Willow Creek Estates. The neighborhood, usually quiet and uneventful, buzzed with nervous energy. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, whispering to each other about what might happen next. Some were curious, others apprehensive, but everyone agreed on one thing. This was unlike anything they'd ever seen before. At the center of it all stood the Thompsons' home, transformed into a fortress of sorts. Drones circled overhead, their cameras capturing every movement around the property. Spotlights illuminated the yard, casting long shadows across the neatly trimmed grass. Loudspeakers crackled intermittently, issuing stern warnings in a robotic voice that sounded eerily official. It was clear that whatever Sarah had planned, she wasn't taking any chances. Mark paced nervously inside the house, glancing out the window every few minutes. Despite his trust in Sarah's capabilities, he couldn't shake the feeling that things were spiraling out of control. "Do you think they'll actually show up?" he asked, turning to Sarah, who sat calmly at the kitchen table reviewing documents. "They will," she replied without looking up. Her tone was steady, almost casual, as if she were discussing dinner plans rather than preparing for a potential showdown. "But when they do, they'll wish they hadn't." Her confidence was both reassuring and intimidating. Mark knew better than to question her judgment. After all, she had spent years commanding elite teams and managing high-stakes operations, but part of him still worried about the fallout. What if the HOA decided to escalate? What if the situation turned ugly? Before he could dwell on those thoughts too long, the sound of engines broke the morning silence. A convoy of black SUVs rolled down the street, stopping just outside the Thompsons' gate. Several men in suits emerged, accompanied by private security contractors hired by the HOA. They carried clipboards, cameras, and what appeared to be legal paperwork. Their expressions were grim, their movements deliberate. One of them stepped forward, addressing the intercom system installed at the entrance. "This is Harold Peterson of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association," he announced, his voice booming through the speakers. "We are here to enforce the eviction order issued against Mark and Sarah Thompson. Please vacate the premises immediately or face further action." For a moment, there was no response. The enforcers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether anyone was even home. Then, slowly, the front door opened and Sarah stepped onto the porch. She wore full tactical gear, complete with a headset and insignia that left no doubt about her rank. Two uniformed officers flanked her, their presence adding to the gravity of the scene. "This is Commander Sarah Thompson," she said coolly, her voice amplified by the loudspeakers so the entire neighborhood could hear. "You are entering restricted airspace and encroaching on federal property. Turn back immediately or face consequences." The enforcers froze, visibly stunned. Harold, who had been puffing out his chest moments earlier, suddenly looked less confident. He glanced at his companions, then back at Sarah, clearly unsure how to proceed. "Federal property?" he stammered. "What are you talking about?" "This is a residential neighborhood." Sarah raised an eyebrow, stepping closer to the gate. "I assure you, Mr. Peterson, this property has been designated as a secure zone under my authority. Your continued presence here violates multiple regulations, including unauthorized entry into restricted airspace. Do I need to explain the penalties for such infractions?" Harold's face reddened as he fumbled for words. "This is ridiculous. You can't just declare your house a military base or whatever. We have rights." "Rights?" Sarah repeated, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "Funny you should mention that, because last I checked, harassing homeowners and threatening eviction isn't exactly within your rights either. But let's not argue semantics. If you don't leave now, I'll be forced to escalate this situation, and trust me, you won't like where that leads." The threat hung in the air, palpable and undeniable. The enforcers shifted uncomfortably, exchanging panicked looks. One of the security contractors muttered something about calling their boss while another pulled out his phone, presumably to verify Sarah's claims. Meanwhile, Harold stood frozen, his bravado crumbling under her unwavering gaze. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Harold held up his hands in surrender. "Fine," he snapped, his voice tinged with frustration. "We'll go for now, but this isn't over." "Oh, I think it is," Sarah replied smoothly. She gestured to the officers beside her, who moved to escort the group off the property. As the SUVs sped away, she turned to Mark, who had joined her on the porch. "Well," he said dryly, "that went better than expected." Sarah smirked, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Told you I had this under control." Word of the confrontation spread quickly, thanks in part to the crowd of neighbors who had gathered to watch the spectacle unfold. Phones recorded every moment, capturing Sarah's commanding demeanor and the enforcers' hasty retreat. By noon, social media was ablaze with posts about the military mom who had taken down the HOA single-handedly. Curious residents approached the Thompsons later that afternoon, eager to learn more about the mysterious woman next door. "Is it true you command a tactical air wing?" one neighbor asked wide-eyed. Another chimed in. "How did you manage to bring in all that equipment? Are you secretly running a government operation?" Sarah handled the attention gracefully, offering vague but intriguing answers. "Let's just say I've been fortunate enough to serve my country in ways most people never experience," she said with a smile. "And as for the equipment, well, let's call it a favor from some very understanding colleagues." While many marveled at her accomplishments, others began questioning the HOA's methods. Conversations shifted from gossip to outrage as details of the organization's bullying tactics came to light. Stories surfaced about families forced to sell their homes due to mounting fines, elderly residents pressured into making costly renovations, and children reprimanded for playing basketball in their driveways. It seemed the Thompson standoff had opened Pandora's box, exposing years of pent-up resentment toward the HOA. As evening fell, Mark and Sarah sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The hum of drones and generators had faded, replaced by the soft chirping of crickets. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt peaceful. "You know," Mark said thoughtfully, leaning back in his chair, "you really gave them a wake-up call today." Sarah nodded, sipping her tea. "Sometimes people need to see things from a different perspective. Hopefully, this will make them realize that power isn't about controlling others. It's about earning respect." "And what happens if they try to retaliate?" Mark asked cautiously. Sarah smiled, setting her cup down. "Then we'll deal with it, but something tells me they'll think twice before crossing us again." As the stars began to twinkle above Willow Creek, it was clear that life in the neighborhood would never be the same. The HOA's grip on the community had weakened, and the Thompsons had become unlikely heroes. But for Sarah and Mark, the real victory wasn't in defeating their opponents. It was in standing up for themselves and proving that sometimes the quietest voices carry the loudest messages.